Globalization, or globalization, is the process of international integration arising from the interchange of worldviews, products, ideas, and other aspects of culture. Advances in transportation and telecommunications infrastructure, including the rise of the telegraph, and its posterity the Internet, are major factors in globalization, generating further interdependence of economic and cultural activities. Though scholars place the origins of globalization in modern times, others trace its history long before the European age of discovery and voyages to the New World. Some even trace the origins to the 3rd millennium BCE. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, the connectedness of the world's economies and cultures grew very quickly. The term globalization has been increasingly used since the mid-1980s. And especially since the mid-1990s. In 2000, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, identified 4 basic aspects of globalization: trade and transactions, capital and investment movements, migration and movement of people, and the dissemination of knowledge. Further, environmental challenges such as climate change, cross-boundary water and air pollution, and overfishing of the ocean are linked with globalization. Globalizing processes affect and are affected by business and work organization, economics, socio-cultural resources, and the natural environment. Overview. Humans have interacted over long distances for thousands of years. The overland Silk Road that connected Asia, Africa, and Europe is a good example of the transformative power of translocal exchange that existed in the Old World. Philosophy, religion, language, the arts, and other aspects of culture spread and mixed as nations exchanged products and ideas. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Europeans made important discoveries in their exploration of the oceans, including the start of transatlantic travel to the New World of the Americas. Global movement of people, goods, and ideas expanded significantly in the following centuries. Early in the 19th century, the development of new forms of transportation, such as the steamship and railroads and telecommunications, that compressed time and space allowed for increasingly rapid rates of global interchange. In the 20th century, road vehicles, intermodal transport, and airlines made transportation even faster. The advent of electronic communications, most notably mobile phones and the Internet, connected billions of people in new ways by the year 2010. Eastern Telegraph Company 1901 chart of undersea telegraph cabling. An example of modern globalizing technology in the beginning of the 20th century. Airline personnel from the jet set age, circa 1960. Etymology and usage. The term globalization is derived from the word globalize, which refers to the emergence of an international network of economic systems. One of the earliest known usages of the term, as a noun, was in a 1930 publication entitled Towards New Education, where it denoted a holistic view of human experience in education. A related term, corporate giants, was coined by Charles Taze Russell in 1897 to refer to the largely national trusts and other large enterprises of the time. By the 1960s, both terms began to be used as synonyms by economists and other social scientists. Economist Theodore Levitt is widely credited with coining the term in an article entitled Globalization of Markets, which appeared in the May-June 1983 issue of Harvard Business Review. However, the term globalization was in use well before, at least as early as 1944, and had been used by other scholars as early as 1981. Levitt can be credited with popularizing the term and bringing it into the mainstream business audience in the later half of the 1980s. Since its inception, the concept of globalization has inspired competing definitions and interpretations, with antecedents dating back to the great movements of trade and empire across Asia and the Indian Ocean from the 15th century onwards. Due to the complexity of the concept, research projects, articles, and discussions often remain focused on a single aspect of globalization. Roland Robertson, professor of sociology at University of Aberdeen, an early writer in the field, defined globalization in 1992 as the compression of the world and the intensification of the consciousness of the world as a whole. Sociologists Martin Albro and Elizabeth King define globalization as all those processes by which the peoples of the world are incorporated into a single world society. In The Consequences of Modernity, Anthony Giddens uses the following definition. Globalization can thus be defined as the intensification of worldwide social relations which link distant localities in such a way that local happenings are shaped by events occurring many miles away, and vice versa. In Global Transformations, David Held, et al., study the definition of globalization. Although in its simplistic sense globalization refers to the widening, deepening, and speeding up of global interconnection, such a definition begs further elaboration. Globalization can be located on a continuum with the local, national and regional. At one end of the continuum social and economic relations and networks which are organized on a local and or national basis. At the other end social and economic relations and networks which crystallize on the wider scale of regional and global interactions. Globalization can refer to those spatial-temporal processes of change which underpin a transformation in the organization of human affairs by linking together and expanding human activity across regions and continents. Without reference to such expansive spatial connections, there can be no clear or coherent formulation of this term. A satisfactory definition of globalization must capture each of these elements: extensity, stretching, intensity, velocity, and impact. Swedish journalist Thomas Larsson, in his book The Race to the Top, The Real Story of Globalization, states that globalization is the process of world shrinkage, of distances getting shorter, things moving closer. It pertains to the increasing ease with which somebody on one side of the world can interact, to mutual benefit, with somebody on the other side of the world. Responding to the many problems with existing definitions of globalization, including the tendencies to give the impression that spatial distance is being overcome, the world is getting smaller, or globalization has always been the same kind of process across human history. Paul James defines globalization with a more direct and historically contextualized emphasis. Globalization is the extension of social relations across world space, defining that world space in terms of the historically variable ways that it has been practiced and socially understood through changing world time. The journalist Thomas L. Friedman popularized the term flat world, arguing that globalized trade, outsourcing, supply chaining, and political forces had permanently changed the world, for better and worse. He asserted that the pace of globalization was quickening, and that its impact on business organization and practice would continue to grow. Economist Takis Fotopoulos defined economic globalization as the opening and deregulation of commodity, capital, and labor markets that led toward present neoliberal globalization. He used political globalization to refer to the emergence of a transnational elite and a phasing out of the nation-state. Cultural globalization he used to reference the worldwide homogenization of culture. Other of his usages included ideological globalization, technological globalization, and social globalization. Manfred Steger, professor of global studies and research leader in the Global Cities Institute at RMIT University, identifies four main empirical dimensions of globalization: economic, political, cultural, and ecological, with a fifth dimension, the ideological, cutting across the other four. The ideological dimension, according to Steger, is filled with a range of norms, claims, beliefs, and narratives about the phenomenon itself. In 2000, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, identified four basic aspects of globalization: trade and transactions, capital and investment movements, migration and movement of people, and the dissemination of knowledge. With regards to trade and transactions, developing countries increase their share of world trade from 19% in 1971 to 29% in 1999. However, there is great variation among the major regions. For instance, the newly industrialized economies, NIEs, of Asia prospered, while African countries, as a whole, performed poorly. The makeup of a country's exports is an important indicator for success. Manufactured goods exports soared, dominated by developed countries and NIEs. Commodity exports, such as food and raw materials, were often produced by developing countries. Commodities' share of total exports declined over the period. Paul James argues that four different forms of globalization can also be distinguished that complement and cut across the solely empirical dimensions. According to James, the oldest dominant form of globalization is embodied globalization, the movement of people. A second form is agency-extended globalization, the circulation of agents of different institutions, organizations, and polities, including imperial agents. Object-extended globalization, a third form, is the movement of commodities and other objects of exchange. The transmission of ideas, images, knowledge, and information across world space he calls disembodied globalization, maintaining that it is currently the dominant form of globalization. James holds that this series of distinctions allows for an understanding of how, today, the most embodied forms of globalization, such as the movement of refugees and migrants, are increasingly restricted, while the most disembodied forms, such as the circulation of financial instruments and codes, are the most deregulated. Globophobia has been used incorrectly to refer to the fear of globalization. History. There are both distal and proximate causes which can be traced in the historical factors affecting globalization. Large-scale globalization began in the 19th century. Archaic. 1st century CE map of Silk Road. Archaic globalization is seen as a phase in the history of globalization, conventionally referring to globalizing events and developments from the time of the earliest civilizations until roughly the 1600s. This term is used to describe the relationships between communities and states, and how they were created by the geographical spread of ideas and social norms at both local and regional levels. In this scheme, three main prerequisites are posited for globalization to occur. The first is the idea of Eastern origins, which shows how Western states have adapted and implemented learned principles from the East. Without the traditional ideas from the East, Western globalization would not have emerged the way it did. The second is distance. The interactions among states were not on a global scale, and most often were confined to Asia, North Africa, the Middle East, and certain parts of Europe. With early globalization, it was difficult for states to interact with others that were not within close proximity. Eventually, technological advances allowed states to learn of others' existence, and another phase of globalization was able to occur. The third has to do with interdependency, stability, and regularity. If a state is not dependent on another, then there is no way for them to be mutually affected by one another. This is one of the driving forces behind global connections and trade. Without either, globalization would not have emerged the way it did, and states would still be dependent on their own production and resources to function. This is one of the arguments surrounding the idea of early globalization. It is argued that archaic globalization did not function in a similar manner to modern globalization, because states were not as interdependent on others as they are today. Also posited is a multipolar nature to archaic globalization, which involved the active participation of non-Europeans. Because it predated the Great Divergence of the 19th century, in which Western Europe pulled ahead of the rest of the world in terms of industrial production and economic output, archaic globalization was a phenomenon that was driven not only by Europe, but also by other economically developed Old World centers such as Gujarat, Bengal, coastal China, and Japan. Portuguese Carrick and Nagasaki, 17th century Japanese Namban art. The German historical economist and sociologist André Gunder Frank argues that a form of globalization began with the rise of trade links between Sumer and the Indus Valley civilization in the 3rd millennium BCE. This archaic globalization existed during the Hellenistic age, when commercialized urban centers enveloped the axis of Greek culture that reached from India to Spain, including Alexandria and the other Alexandrian cities. Early on, the geographic position of Greece and the necessity of importing wheat forced the Greeks to engage in maritime trade. Trade in ancient Greece was largely unrestricted. The state controlled only the supply of grain. Native New World crops exchanged globally: maize, tomato, potato, vanilla, rubber, cacao, tobacco. Trade on the Silk Road was a significant factor in the development of the civilizations of China, the Indian subcontinent, Persia, Europe, and Arabia, opening long-distance, political and economic interactions between the civilizations. Though silk was certainly the major trade item from China, many other goods were traded, and religions, syncretic philosophies, and various technologies, as well as diseases, also traveled along the Silk routes. In addition to economic trade, the Silk Road served as a means of carrying out cultural trade among the civilizations along its network. Early modern. Proto-globalization. Early modern or proto-globalization covers a period of the history of globalization roughly spanning the years between 1600 and 1800. The concept of proto-globalization was first introduced by historians A.G. Hopkins and Christopher Bailey. The term describes the phase of increasing trade links and cultural exchange that characterized the period immediately preceding the advent of high modern globalization in the late 19th century. This phase of globalization was characterized by the rise of maritime European empires in the 16th and 17th centuries, first the Portuguese and Spanish empires, and later the Dutch and British empires. In the 17th century, world trade developed further when chartered companies, like the British East India Company, founded in 1600, and the Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, often described as the first multinational corporation in which stock was offered, were established. Early modern globalization is distinguished from modern globalization on the basis of expansionism, the method of managing global trade, and the level of information exchange. The period is marked by such trade arrangements as the East India Company, the shift of hegemony to Western Europe, the rise of larger-scale conflicts between powerful nations such as the 30-Year War, and a rise of new commodities, most particularly slave trade. The triangular trade made it possible for Europe to take advantage of resources within the Western Hemisphere. The transfer of animal stocks, plant crops, and epidemic diseases associated with Alfred Crosby's concept of the Columbian Exchange also played a central role in this process. Early modern trade and communications involved a vast group including European, Muslim, Indian, Southeast Asian, and Chinese merchants, particularly in the Indian Ocean region. 19th century Great Britain was an early global superpower. Modern. During the 19th century, globalization approached its modern form as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Industrialization allowed standardized production of household items using economies of scale, while rapid population growth created sustained demand for commodities. Globalization in this period was decisively shaped by 19th century imperialism. In the 19th century, steamships reduced the cost of international transport significantly, and railroads made inland transport cheaper. The transport revolution occurred sometime between 1820 and 1850. More nations embraced international trade. Globalization in this period was decisively shaped by 19th century imperialism such as in Africa and Asia. The invention of shipping containers in 1956 helped advance the globalization of commerce. After the Second World War, work by politicians led to the Bretton Woods Conference, an agreement by major governments to lay down the framework for international monetary policy, commerce, and finance, and the founding of several international institutions intended to facilitate economic growth. Multiple rounds of trade opening simplified and lowered trade barriers. Initially, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, led to a series of agreements to remove trade restrictions. GATT's successor was the World Trade Organization, WTO, which provided a framework for negotiating and formalizing trade agreements and a dispute resolution process. Exports nearly doubled from 8.5% of total gross world product in 1970 to 16.2% in 2001. The approach of using global agreements to advance trade stumbled with the failure of the Doha round of trade negotiation. Many countries then shifted to bilateral or smaller multilateral agreements, such as the 2011 South Korea-United States Free Trade Agreement. Since the 1970s, aviation has become increasingly affordable to middle classes in developed countries. Open skies policies and low-cost carriers have helped to bring competition to the market. In the 1990s, the growth of low-cost communication networks cut the cost of communicating between different countries. More work can be performed using a computer without regard to location. This included accounting, software development, and engineering design. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, the connectedness of the world's economies and cultures grew very quickly. This slowed down from the 1910s onward due to the World Wars and the Cold War, but picked up again in the 1980s and 1990s. The revolutions of 1989 and subsequent liberalization in many parts of the world resulted in a significant expansion of global interconnectedness. The migration and movement of people can also be highlighted as a prominent feature of the globalization process. In the period between 1965-90, the proportion of the labor force migrating approximately doubled. Most migration occurred between developing countries and least developed countries, LDCs. Internet has become influential in connecting people across the world. As of June 2012, more than 2.4 billion people, over a third of the world's human population, have used the services of the Internet. Growth of globalization has never been smooth. One influential event was the late 2000s recession, which was associated with lower growth, such as cross-border phone calls and ski pay usage, or even temporarily negative growth, such as trade of global interconnectedness. DHL Global Connectedness Index studies four main types of cross-border flow: trade in both goods and services, information, people, including tourists, students, and migrants, and capital. It shows that the depth of global integration fell by about 1/10 after 2008, but by 2013 had recovered well above its pre-crash peak. Globalized society offers a complex web of forces and factors that bring people, cultures, markets, beliefs, and practices into increasingly greater proximity to one another. Global Business Organization. Global Competitiveness Index, 2008-2009. Competitiveness is an important determinant for the well-being of nation-states in an international environment. With improvements in transportation and communication, international business grew rapidly after the beginning of the 20th century. International business includes all commercial transactions, private sales, investments, logistics, and transportation that take place between two or more regions, countries, and nations beyond their political boundaries. Such international diversification is tied with firm performance and innovation, positively in the case of the former and often negatively in the case of the latter. Usually, private companies undertake such transactions for profit. These business transactions involve economic resources such as capital, natural, and human resources used for international production of physical goods and services such as finance, banking, insurance, construction, and other productive activities. International business arrangements have led to the formation of multinational enterprises, M&E companies, that have a worldwide approach to markets and production, or one with operations in more than one country. A M&E may also be called a multinational corporation, MNC, or transnational company, TNC. Well-known MNCs include fast food companies such as McDonald's and Yum Brands, vehicle manufacturers such as General Motors, Ford Motor Company and Toyota, consumer electronics companies like Samsung, LG, and Sony, and energy companies such as ExxonMobil, Shell, and BP. Most of the largest corporations operate in multiple national markets. Businesses generally argue that survival in the new global marketplace requires companies to source goods, services, labor, and materials overseas to continuously upgrade their products and technology in order to survive increased competition. According to a recent McKinsey Global Institute report, flows of goods, services, and finance reached $26 trillion in 2012, or 36% of global GDP, 1.5 times the level in 1990. International trade. Singapore, the top country in the Enabling Trade Index, embraced globalization and became a highly developed country. International trade is the exchange of capital, goods, and services across international borders or territories. In most countries, such trade represents a significant share of gross domestic product, GDP. Industrialization, advanced transportation, multinational corporations, offshoring, and outsourcing all have a major impact on world trade. The growth of international trade is a fundamental component of globalization. An absolute trade advantage exists when countries can produce a commodity with less costs per unit produce than could its trading partner. By the same reasoning, it should import commodities in which it has an absolute disadvantage. While there are possible gains from trade with absolute advantage, comparative advantage, that is, the ability to offer goods and services at a lower marginal and opportunity cost extends the range of possible mutually beneficial exchanges. In a globalized business environment, companies argue that the comparative advantages offered by international trade have become essential to remaining competitive. Trade agreements, economic blocs, and special trade zones. Gross domestic product in 2011 US dollars per capita, adjusted for inflation and purchasing power parity, log scale, from 1860 to 2011, with population, disc area, for the US, yellow, UK, orange, Japan, red, China, red, and India, blue. Establishment of free trade areas has become an essential feature of modern governments to handle preferential trading arrangements with foreign and multinational entities. A special economic zone, says, is a geographical region that has economic and other laws that are more free market-oriented than a country's typical or national laws. Nationwide laws may be suspended inside these special zones. The category, says, covers many areas, including free trade zones, FTZ, export processing zones, EPZ, free zones, FZ, industrial parks, or industrial estates, i.e., free ports, urban enterprise zones, and others. Usually the goal of a structure is to increase foreign direct investment by foreign investors, typically an international business, or a multinational corporation, MNC. These are designated areas in which companies are taxed very lightly, or not at all, in order to encourage economic activity. Free ports have historically been endowed with favorable customs regulations, e.g., the Free Port of Trieste. Very often free ports constitute a part of free economic zones. A FTZ is an area within which goods may be landed, handled, manufactured, or reconfigured, and re-exported without the intervention of the customs authorities. Only when the goods are moved to consumers within the country in which the zone is located do they become subject to the prevailing customs duties. Free trade zones are organized around major seaports, international airports, and national frontiers areas with many geographic advantages for trade. It is a region where a group of countries has agreed to reduce or eliminate trade barriers. A billboard in Jakarta welcoming ASEAN Summit 2011 delegates. A free trade area is a trade bloc whose member countries have signed a free trade agreement which eliminates tariffs, import quotas, and preferences on most, if not all, goods and services traded between them. If people are also free to move between the countries, in addition to a free trade area, it would also be considered an open border. The European Union, for example, a confederation of 27 member states, provides both a free trade area and an open border. Qualifying industrial zones, QIZ, are industrial parks that house manufacturing operations in Jordan and Egypt. They are special free trade zones established in collaboration with neighboring Israel to take advantage of the free trade agreements between the United States and Israel. Under the trade agreements with Jordan, As laid down by the United States, goods produced in QIZ-notified areas can directly access U.S. markets without tariff or quota restrictions, subject to certain conditions. To qualify, goods produced in these zones must contain a small portion of Israeli input. In addition, a minimum 35% value to the goods must be added to the finished product. The brainchild of Jordanian businessman Omar Salah, the first QIZ was authorized by the United States Congress in 1997. The Asia-Pacific has been described as the most integrated trading region on the planet because its intra-regional trade accounts probably for as much as 50 to 60% of the region's total imports and exports. It has also extra-regional trade, consumer goods exports such as televisions, radios, bicycles, and textiles into the United States, Europe, and Japan fueled the economic expansion. The ASEAN Free Trade Area is a trade bloc agreement by the Association of Southeast Asian Nations supporting local manufacturing in all ASEAN countries. The AFTA agreement was signed on the 28th of January, 1992, in Singapore. When the AFTA agreement was originally signed, ASEAN had 6 members, namely Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand. Vietnam joined in 1995, Laos and Myanmar in 1997, and Cambodia in 1999. Tax havens. The ratio of German assets in tax havens in relation to the total German GDP. The Big Seven shown are Hong Kong, Ireland, Lebanon, Liberia, Panama, Singapore, and Switzerland. A tax haven is a state, country, or territory where certain taxes are levied at a low rate, or not at all, which are used by businesses for tax avoidance and tax evasion. Individuals and/or corporate entities can find it attractive to establish shell subsidiaries or move themselves to areas with reduced or nil taxation levels. This creates a situation of tax competition among governments. Different jurisdictions tend to be havens for different types of taxes and for different categories of people and companies. The central feature of a tax haven is that its laws and other measures can be used to evade or avoid the tax laws or regulations of other jurisdictions. A 2012 report from the Tax Justice Network estimated that between $21 trillion and $32 trillion is sheltered from taxes in unreported tax havens worldwide. Tax havens have been criticized because they often result in the accumulation of idle cash that is expensive and inefficient for companies to repatriate. The tax shelter benefits result in a tax incidence disadvantaging the poor. Many tax havens are thought to have connections to fraud, money laundering, and terrorism. While investigations of illegal tax haven abuse have been ongoing, there have been few convictions. International tourism. Tourism is travel for recreational, leisure, or business purposes. The World Tourism Organization defines tourists as people traveling to and staying in places outside their usual environment for not more than one consecutive year for leisure, business, and other purposes. There are many forms of tourism such as agritourism, birth tourism, culinary tourism, cultural tourism, ecotourism, extreme tourism, geotourism, heritage tourism, LGBT tourism, medical tourism, nautical tourism, pop culture tourism, religious tourism, slum tourism, war tourism, and wildlife tourism. Globalization has made tourism a popular global leisure activity. The World Health Organization, WHO, estimates that up to 500,000 people are in flight at any one time. Modern aviation has made it possible to travel long distances quickly. As a result of the late 2000s recession, international travel demand suffered a strong slowdown from the second half of 2008 through the end of 2009. After a 5% increase in the first half of 2008, growth in international tourist arrivals moved into negative territory in the second half of 2008 and ended up only 2% for the year, compared to a 7% increase in 2007. This negative trend intensified during 2009, exacerbated in some countries due to the outbreak of the H1N1 influenza virus, resulting in a worldwide decline of 4.2% in 2009 to 880 million international tourist arrivals, and a 5.7% decline in international tourism receipts. One notable exception to more free travel is travel from the United States to bordering countries Canada and Mexico, which had been semi-open borders. Now, by U.S. law, travel to these countries requires a passport. In 2010, international tourism reached US $919 billion, growing 6.5% over 2009, corresponding to an increase in real terms of 4.7%. In 2010, there were over 940 million international tourist arrivals worldwide. International sports. Wheelchair basketball teams playing in the 2008 Summer Paralympics. Modern international sports events can be big business for as well as influencing the political, economical, and other cultural aspects of countries around the world. Especially with politics and sports, sports can affect countries, their identities, and in consequence, the world. The ancient Olympic Games were a series of competitions held between representatives of several city-states and kingdoms from ancient Greece, which featured mainly athletic, but also combat and chariot racing events. During the Olympic Games, all struggles against the participating city-states were postponed until the Games were finished. The origin of these Olympics is shrouded in mystery and legend. During the 19th century, Olympic Games became a popular global event. While some economists are skeptical about the economic benefits of hosting the Olympic Games, emphasizing that such mega events often have large costs, hosting, or even bidding for, the Olympics appears to increase the host country's exports, as the host or candidate country sends a signal about trade openness when bidding to host the Games. Moreover, research suggests that hosting the Summer Olympics has a strong positive effect on the philanthropic contributions of corporations headquartered in the host city, which seems to benefit the local nonprofit sector. This positive effect begins in the years leading up to the Games, and might persist for several years afterwards, although not permanently. This finding suggests that hosting the Olympics might create opportunities for cities to influence local corporations in ways that benefit the local nonprofit sector and civil society. The Games have also had significant negative effects on host communities. For example, the Center on Housing Rights and Evictions reports that the Olympics displaced more than 2 million people over 2 decades, often disproportionately affecting disadvantaged groups. Globalization has continually increased international competition in sports. The FIFA World Cup, for example, is the world's most widely viewed sporting event. An estimated 700 million people watched the final match of the 2010 FIFA World Cup held in South Africa. According to a 2011 AT study of sports teams, leagues, and federations, the global sports industry is worth between $350 billion and $450 billion. US $480 to $620 billion. 87. This includes infrastructure construction, sporting goods, licensed products, and live sports events. Illicit international trade. Black market and transnational organized crime. The black market in rhinoceros horn reduced the world's rhino population by more than 90% over the past 40 years. Black markets and organized crime often operate on a transnational basis, with global sales totaling almost $1 trillion annually as of 2013. In 2010, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, reported that the global drug trade generated more than $20 billion a year in revenues. The UN estimated that as of 2000 there were more than 50 million regular users of heroin, cocaine, and synthetic drugs worldwide. The international trade of endangered species was second only to drug trafficking among smuggling industries. Traditional Chinese medicine often incorporates ingredients from all parts of plants, the leaf, stem, flower, root, and also ingredients from animals and minerals. The use of parts of endangered species, such as seahorses, rhinoceros horns, saiga antelope horns, and tiger bones and claws, resulted in a black market of poachers who hunt restricted animals. Economic globalization. Shanghai has become a symbol of the recent economic boom of China. In 2011, China had 960,000 millionaires. Economic globalization is the increasing economic interdependence of national economies across the world through a rapid increase in cross-border movement of goods, service, technology, and capital. Whereas the globalization of business is centered around the diminution of international trade regulations as well as tariffs, taxes, and other impediments that suppresses global trade. Economic globalization is the process of increasing economic integration between countries, leading to the emergence of a global marketplace, or a single world market. Depending on the paradigm, economic globalization can be viewed as either a positive or a negative phenomenon. Economic globalization comprises the globalization of production, markets, competition, technology, and corporations and industries. Current globalization trends can be largely accounted for by developed economies integrating with less developed economies by means of foreign direct investment, the reduction of trade barriers as well as other economic reforms, and, in many cases, immigration. In 1944, 44 nations attended the Bretton Woods Conference with the purpose of stabilizing world currencies and establishing credit for international trade in the post-World War II era. While the international economic order envisioned by the conference gave way to the neoliberal economic order prevalent today, the conference established many of the organizations essential to advancement towards a close-knit global economy and global financial system, such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the International Trade Organization. As an example, Chinese economic reform began to open China to globalization in the 1980s. Scholars find that China has attained a degree of openness that is unprecedented among large and populous nations, with competition from foreign goods in almost every sector of the economy. Foreign investment helped to greatly increase product quality and knowledge and standards, especially in heavy industry. China's experience supports the assertion that globalization greatly increases wealth for poor countries. As of 2005-2007, the port of Shanghai holds the title as the world's busiest port. In India, business process outsourcing has been described as the primary engine of the country's development over the next few decades, contributing broadly to GDP growth, employment growth, and poverty alleviation. Red, U.S. corporate profits after tax. Blue, U.S. non-residential business investment, both as fractions of GDP, 1989-2012. Wealth concentration of corporate profits in global tax havens due to tax avoidance spurred by imposition of austerity measures can stall investment, inhibiting further growth. Global financial system. By the early 21st century, the worldwide framework of legal agreements, institutions, and both formal and informal economic actors came together to facilitate international flows of financial capital for purposes of investment and trade financing. This global financial system emerged during the first modern wave of economic globalization, marked by the establishment of central banks, multilateral treaties, and intergovernmental organizations aimed at improving the transparency, regulation, and effectiveness of international markets. The world economy became increasingly financially integrated throughout the 20th century as nations liberalized capital accounts and deregulated financial sectors. With greater exposure to volatile capital flows, a series of financial crises in Europe, Asia, and Latin America had contagious effects on other countries. By the early 21st century, financial institutions had become increasingly large with a more sophisticated and interconnected range of investment activities. Thus, when the United States experienced a financial crisis early in that century, it quickly propagated among other nations. It became known as the global financial crisis and is recognized as the catalyst for the worldwide Great Recession. Inequality. Increasing international commerce with high barriers to entry, corporate consolidation, tax havens, and other methods of tax avoidance and political corruption have all caused increases in income inequality and wealth concentration. The increasingly unequal distribution of economic assets, wealth, and income within or between global populations, countries, and individuals. Economic inequality varies between societies, historical periods, economic structures, or systems, for example, capitalism or socialism, ongoing or past wars, between genders, and between differences in individuals' abilities to create wealth. There are various numerical indices for measuring economic inequality. A prominent one is the Gini coefficient, but there are also many other methods. While within-country income inequality has increased throughout the globalization period, globally inequality has lessened, as developing countries have experienced much more rapid growth. Economic inequality varies between societies, historical periods, economic structures, or economic systems, ongoing or past wars, between genders, and between differences in individuals' abilities to create wealth. Among the various numerical indices for measuring economic inequality, the Gini coefficient is most often cited. Of the factors influencing the duration of economic growth in both developed and developing countries, income equality has a more beneficial impact than trade openness, sound political institutions, and foreign investment. Economic inequality affects equity, equality of outcome, and subsequent equality of opportunity. Although earlier studies considered economic inequality as necessary and beneficial, some economists see it as an important social problem. Early studies suggesting that greater equality inhibits economic growth did not account for lags between inequality changes and growth changes. Later studies claimed that one of the most robust determinants of sustained economic growth is the level of income inequality. International inequality is inequality between countries. Income differences between rich and poor countries are very large, although they are changing rapidly. Per capita incomes in China and India doubled in the prior 20 years, a feat that required 150 years in the U.S. According to the United Nations Human Development Report for 2013, for countries at varying levels of the Human Development Index, the GNP per capita grew between 2004 and 2013 from 24,806 to 33,391, or 35%. Very high human development. 4,269 to 5,428, or 27%, medium, and 1,184 to 1,633, or 38%, low, PPP$, respectively. PPP$ equals purchasing power parity measured in United States dollars. Certain demographic changes in the developing world, after active economic liberalization and international integration, resulted in rising welfare and hence reduced inequality. According to Martin Wolf, in the developing world, as a whole, life expectancy rose by 4 months each year after 1970, and infant mortality rate declined from 107 per thousand in 1970 to 58 in 2000 due to improvements in standards of living and health conditions. Also, adult literacy in developing countries rose from 53% in 1970 to 74% in 1998, and much lower literacy rate among the young guarantees that rates will continue to fall as time passes. Furthermore, the reduction in fertility rates in the developing world as a whole from 4.1 births per woman in 1980 to 2.8 in 2000 indicates improved education level of women on fertility and control of fewer children with more parental attention and investment. Consequently, more prosperous and educated parents with fewer children have chosen to withdraw their children from the labor force to give them opportunities to be educated at school, improving the issue of child labor. Thus, despite seemingly unequal distribution of income within these developing countries, their economic growth and development have brought about improved standards of living and welfare for the population as a whole. Capital flight. Capital flight occurs when assets or money rapidly flow out of a country because of that country's recent increase in taxes, tariffs, labor costs, or other unfavorable financial conditions such as government debt defaulting, which disturb investors. This leads to a sometimes very rapid disappearance of wealth, and is usually accompanied by a sharp drop in the exchange rate of the affected country, leading into depreciation in a variable currency exchange rate regime, or a forced devaluation under fixed exchange rates. This can be particularly damaging when the capital belongs to the people of the affected country, because not only are the citizens now burdened by the loss of faith in the economy and devaluation of their currency, but probably also their assets have lost much of their nominal value. This leads to dramatic decreases in the purchasing power of the country's assets, and makes it increasingly expensive to import goods. The Argentine economic crisis of 2001 caused a currency devaluation and capital flight, which resulted in a sharp drop in imports. Capital flight can cause liquidity crises in the affected countries from which capital is flowing, the countries in which investors are trying to liquidate their assets, and other countries involved in international commerce such as shipping and finance. A 2008 paper published by Global Financial Integrity estimated capital flight, or illicit financial flows out of developing countries, to be at a rate of some US $850 billion to $1 trillion a year. Market participants in need of cash find it hard to locate potential trading partners to sell their assets. This may result as a consequence of limited market participation, or because of a decrease in cash held by financial market participants. Thus, asset holders may be forced to sell their assets at a price below the long-term fundamental price. Borrowers typically face higher loan costs and collateral requirements compared to periods of ample liquidity, and unsecured debt is nearly impossible to attain. Typically, during a liquidity crisis, the interbank lending market does not function smoothly either. Capital flight affects advanced economies as well. A 2009 article in The Times reported that hundreds of wealthy financiers and entrepreneurs had recently fled the United Kingdom in response to recent tax increases, relocating in low-tax destinations such as Jersey, Guernsey, the Isle of Man, and the British Virgin Islands. In May 2012, the scale of Greek capital flight in the wake of the first undecided legislative election was estimated at $4 billion a week. And later that month, the Spanish central bank revealed $97 billion in capital flight from the Spanish economy for the first quarter of 2012. Measuring globalization. Indices. Globalization Index. Globalization Index. Measurement of economic globalization focuses on variables such as trade, foreign direct investment, FDI, portfolio investment, and income. However, newer indices attempt to measure globalization in more general terms, including variables related to political, social, cultural, and even environmental aspects of globalization. One index of globalization is the KOF index, which measures three important dimensions of globalization: economic, social, and political. Another is the Kearney/Foreign Policy Magazine Globalization Index. 2014 KOF Index of Globalization rank country 1 Ireland, 2 Belgium, 3 Netherlands, 4 Austria, 5 Singapore, 6 Denmark, 7 Sweden, 8 Portugal, 9 Hungary, 10 Finland. 2006 Kearney/Foreign Policy Magazine Globalization Index rank country 1 Singapore, 2 Switzerland, 3 United States, 4 Ireland, 5 Denmark, 6 Canada, 7 Netherlands, 8 Australia, 9 Austria, 10 Sweden. The Good Country Index. Good Country Index. The index is a composite statistic of 35 data points which are mostly generated by the United Nations. These data points are combined into a common measure which gives an overall ranking, and a ranking in 7 categories such as science and technology, culture, international peace and security, world order, planet and climate, prosperity and equality, health and well-being. 2014 Top 10 Overall Rank. 2014 Rank Country or Territory 1 Ireland, 2 Finland, 3 Switzerland, 4 Netherlands, 5 New Zealand, 6 Sweden, 7 United Kingdom, 8 Norway, 9 Denmark, 10 Belgium. Free Trade Policies. Global Enabling Trade Report. The Enabling Trade Index measures the factors, policies, and services that facilitate the trade in goods across borders and to destinations. It is made up of 4 sub-indexes: market access, border administration, transport and communications infrastructure, and business environment. The top 20 countries are listed below. Global Enabling Trade Report 2010. 1. Singapore 6.06. 2. Hong Kong 5.70. 3. Denmark 5.41. 4. Sweden 5.41. 5. Switzerland 5.37. 6. New Zealand 5.33. 7. Norway 5.32. 8. Canada 5.29. 9. Luxembourg 5.28. 10. Netherlands 5.26. 11. Iceland 5.26. 12. Finland 5.25. 13. Germany 5.20. 14. Austria 5.17. 15. Australia 5.13. 16. United Arab Emirates 5.12. 17. United Kingdom 5.06. 18. Chile 5.06. 19. United States 5.03. 20. France 5.02. Global Enabling Trade Report 2014. 1. Singapore 5.9. 2. Hong Kong 5.5. 3. Netherlands 5.3. 4. New Zealand 5.2. 5. Finland 5.2. 6. United Kingdom 5.2. 7. Switzerland 5.2. 8. Chile 5.1. 9. Sweden 5.1. 10. Germany 5.1. 11. Luxembourg 5.1. 12. Norway 5.1. 13. Japan 5.1. 14. Canada 5.0. 15. United States 5.0. 16. United Arab Emirates 5.0. 17. Denmark 5.0. 18. Austria 4.9. 19. Qatar 4.9. 20. Belgium 4.9. Culture. Cultural globalization has increased cross-cultural contacts, but may be accompanied by a decrease in the uniqueness of one's isolated communities. For example, sushi is available in Germany as well as Japan, but Euro Disney outdraws the city of Paris, potentially reducing demand for authentic French pastry. Globalization's contribution to the alienation of individuals from their traditions may be modest compared to the impact of modernity itself, as alleged by existentialists such as Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus. Globalization has expanded recreational opportunities by spreading pop culture, particularly via the internet and satellite television. Religious movements were among the earliest cultural elements to globalize, being spread by force, migration, evangelists, imperialists, and traders. Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and more recently sects such as Mormonism, which have taken root and influenced endemic cultures in places far from their origins. A McDonald's in Osaka, Japan illustrates the McDonaldization of global society. Conversely claimed in 2010 that globalization was predominantly driven by the outward flow of culture and economic activity from the United States, and was better understood as Americanization or Westernization. For example, the 2 most successful global food and beverage outlets are American companies. McDonald's and Starbucks are often cited as examples of globalization, with over 32,000 and 18,000 locations operating worldwide, respectively, as of 2008. The term globalization implies transformation. Cultural practices including traditional music can be lost or turned into a fusion of traditions. Globalization can trigger a state of emergency for the preservation of musical heritage. Archivists must attempt to collect, record, or transcribe repertoires before melodies are assimilated or modified. Local musicians struggle for authenticity and to preserve local musical traditions. Globalization can lead performers to discard traditional instruments. Fusion genres can become interesting fields of analysis. Music has an important role in economic and cultural development during globalization. Music genres such as jazz and reggae began locally and later became international phenomena. Globalization gave support to the world music phenomenon by allowing music from developing countries to reach broader audiences. The term world music was originally intended for ethnic-specific music. Now, globalization is expanding its scope such that the term often includes hybrid subgenres such as world fusion, global fusion, ethnic fusion, and world beat. A Coca-Cola stall outside the Grand Gateway 66 shopping mall in Zhujiayu, Shanghai. Bourdieu claimed that the perception of consumption can be seen as self-identification and the formation of identity. Musically, this translates into each being having his own musical identity based on likes and tastes. These likes and tastes are greatly influenced by culture, as this is the most basic cause for a person's wants and behavior. The concept of one's own culture is now in a period of change due to globalization. Also, globalization has increased the interdependency of political, personal, cultural and economic factors. A 2005 UNESCO report showed that cultural exchange is becoming more frequent from Eastern Asia, but Western countries are still the main exporters of cultural goods. In 2002, China was the third largest exporter of cultural goods after the UK and US. Between 1994 and 2002, both North America's and the European Union's shares of cultural exports declined while Asia's cultural exports grew to surpass North America. Related factors are the fact that Asia's population and area are several times that of North America. Americanization is related to a period of high political American clout and of significant growth of America's shops, markets, and objects being brought into other countries. Some critics of globalization argue that it harms the diversity of cultures. As a dominating country's culture is introduced into a receiving country through globalization, it can become a threat to the diversity of local culture. Some argue that globalization may ultimately lead to westernization or Americanization of culture, where the dominating cultural concepts of economically and politically powerful Western countries spread and cause harm on local cultures. So, globalization, a diverse phenomenon, relates to a multilateral political world, and to the increase of cultural objects and markets between countries. The Indian experience particularly reveals the plurality of the impact of cultural globalization. Multilingualism and the emergence of lingua francis. Most people in the world are multilingual. Language contact occurs when two or more languages or varieties interact. Language contact occurs in a variety of phenomena, including language convergence, borrowing, and relexification. The most common products are pidgins, creoles, code switching, and mixed languages. Multilingualism is becoming a social phenomenon governed by the needs of globalization and cultural openness. Thanks to the ease of access to information facilitated by the Internet, individuals' exposure to multiple languages is becoming more and more frequent, triggering, therefore, the need to acquire more and more languages. A lingua franca is a language systematically used to make communication possible between people not sharing a mother tongue. In particular when it is a third language, distinct from both mother tongues. Today, the most popular second language is English. Some 3.5 billion people have some acquaintance of the language. English is the dominant language on the Internet. About 35% of the world's mail, telexes, and cables are in English. Approximately 40% of the world's radio programs are in English. While multilingualism is common among individuals, globally the number of spoken languages is decreasing. The top 20 languages spoken by more than 50 million speakers each are spoken by some 50% of the world's population, whereas many of the other languages are spoken in small communities, most with less than 10,000 speakers. Historically, these less widespread languages were afforded protection through geographical isolation. Today, speakers of regional and minority languages are increasingly unable to compete with those who speak dominant languages, such that these languages are now considered endangered languages. The total number of languages in the world is not precisely known and estimates vary depending on many factors. The current estimate is that there are between 6,000 and 7,000 languages spoken, and between 50–90% of those will have become extinct by the year 2100. Politics. The United Nations headquarters in New York City. In general, globalization may ultimately reduce the importance of nation-states. Supranational institutions such as the European Union, the WTO, the G8, or the International Criminal Court replace or extend national functions to facilitate international agreement. Some observers attribute the relative decline in U.S. power to globalization, particularly due to the country's high trade deficit. This led to a global power shift towards Asian states, particularly China, which unleashed market forces and achieved tremendous growth rates. As of 2011, the Chinese economy was on track to overtake the United States by 2025. Increasingly, non-governmental organizations influence public policy across national boundaries, including humanitarian aid and developmental efforts. Philanthropic organizations with global missions are also coming to the forefront of humanitarian efforts. Charities such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Ocean International, the Acumen Fund, now Acumen, and the Echoing Green have combined the business model with philanthropy, giving rise to business organizations such as the Global Philanthropy Group and new associations of philanthropists such as the Global Philanthropy Forum. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation projects include a current multi-billion-dollar commitment to funding immunizations in some of the world's more impoverished but rapidly growing countries, and hundreds of millions of dollars in the next few years to programs aimed at encouraging saving by the world's poor. The Hudson Institute estimates total private philanthropic flows to developing countries at US $59 billion in 2010. As a response to globalization, some countries have embraced isolationist policies. For example, the North Korean government makes it very difficult for foreigners to enter the country and strictly monitors their activities when they do. Aid workers are subject to considerable scrutiny and excluded from places and regions the government does not wish them to enter. Citizens cannot freely leave the country. Media and public opinion. A 2005 study by Pierre Fass and Paul Hirsch found a large increase in articles negative towards globalization in the years prior. In 1998, negative articles outpaced positive articles by 2-1. In 2008, Greggett claimed this rise in opposition to globalization can be explained, at least in part, by economic self-interest. The number of newspaper articles showing negative framing rose from about 10% of the total in 1991 to 55% of the total in 1999. This increase occurred during a period when the total number of articles concerning globalization nearly doubled. A number of international polls have shown that residents of Africa and Asia tend to view globalization more favorably than residents of Europe or North America. In Africa, a Gallup poll found that 70% of the population views globalization favorably. The BBC found that 50% of people believed that economic globalization was proceeding too rapidly, while 35% believed it was proceeding too slowly. Philip Gordon stated that as of 2004 a clear majority of Europeans believe that globalization can enrich their lives, while believing the European Union can help them take advantage of globalization's benefits, while shielding them from its negative effects. The main opposition consisted of socialists, environmental groups, and nationalists. Residents of the EU did not appear to feel threatened by globalization in 2004. The EU job market was more stable and workers were less likely to accept wage/benefit cuts. Social spending was much higher than in the US. In a Danish poll in 2007, 76% responded that globalization is a good thing. This et al. Surveyed U.S. opinion in 1993. Their survey showed that, in 1993, more than 40% of respondents were unfamiliar with the concept of globalization. When the survey was repeated in 1998, 89% of the respondents had a polarized view of globalization as being either good or bad. At the same time, discourse on globalization, which began in the financial community before shifting to a heated debate between proponents and disenchanted students and workers. Polarization increased dramatically after the establishment of the WTO in 1995. This event and subsequent protests led to a large-scale anti-globalization movement. Initially, college-educated workers were likely to support globalization. Less educated workers, who were more likely to compete with immigrants and workers in developing countries, tended to be opponents. The situation changed after the financial crisis of 2007. According to a 1997 poll, 58% of college graduates said globalization had been good for the U.S. By 2008, only 33% thought it was good. Respondents with high school education also became more opposed. According to Takanaka Heizo and Chidori Yokichi, as of 1998 there was a perception in Japan that the economy was small and frail. However, Japan was resource poor and used exports to pay for its raw materials. Anxiety over their position caused terms such as internationalization and globalization to enter everyday language. However, Japanese tradition was to be as self-sufficient as possible, particularly in agriculture. Many in developing countries see globalization as a positive force that lifts them out of poverty. Those opposing globalization typically combine environmental concerns with nationalism. Opponents consider governments as agents of neocolonialism that are subservient to multinational corporations. Much of this criticism comes from the middle class. The Brookings Institute suggested this was because the middle class perceived upwardly mobile low-income groups as threatening to their economic security. The nonprofit Reporters Without Borders publishes a Press Freedom Index, an annual ranking of countries based upon the organization's assessment of the country's press freedom records in the previous year. It reflects the degree of freedom that journalists, news organizations, and netizens enjoy in each country, and the efforts made by the authorities to respect and ensure respect for this freedom. Internet. Global Internet usage. Both a product of globalization as well as a catalyst, the Internet connects computer users around the world. From 2000 to 2009, the number of Internet users globally rose from 394 million to 1.858 billion. By 2010, 22% of the world's population had access to computers with 1 billion Google searches every day. 300 million Internet users reading blogs, and 2 billion videos viewed daily on YouTube. According to research from IDC, the size of total worldwide e-commerce, when global business-to-business and consumer transactions are added together, will equate to $6 trillion in 2013. Adati, another research firm, estimates the global market for digital products and services at $4.4 trillion in 2013. A report by Oxford Economics adds those two together to estimate the total size of the digital economy at $20.4 trillion, equivalent to roughly 13.8% of global sales. While much has been written of the economic advantages of Internet-enabled commerce, there is also evidence that some aspects of the Internet, such as maps and location-aware services, may serve to reinforce economic inequality and the digital divide. Electronic commerce may be partly responsible for consolidation and the decline of mom-and-pop, brick-and-mortar businesses, resulting in increases in income inequality. An online community is a virtual community that exists online and whose members enable its existence through taking part in membership ritual. Significant socio-technical change may have resulted from the proliferation of such internet-based social networks. The world population has experienced continuous growth since the end of the Great Famine and the Black Death in 1350, when it stood at around 370 million. The highest rates of growth global population increases above 1.8% per year were seen briefly during the 1950s and for a longer period during the 1960s and 1970s. The growth rate peaked at 2.2% in 1963 and had declined to 1.1% by 2011. Total annual births were highest in the late 1980s, at about 138 million. And are now expected to remain essentially constant at their 2011 level of 134 million, while deaths number 56 million per year and are expected to increase to 80 million per year by 2040. Current projections show a continued increase in population, but a steady decline in the population growth rate, with the global population expected to reach 7.5 and 10.5 billion by 2050. The head of the International Food Policy Research Institute stated in 2008 that the gradual change in diet among newly prosperous populations is the most important factor underpinning the rise in global food prices. From 1950 to 1984, as the Green Revolution transformed agriculture around the world, grain production increased by over 250%. World population has grown by about 4 billion since the beginning of the Green Revolution, and without it, there would be greater famine and malnutrition than the IM presently documents, approximately 850 million people suffering from chronic malnutrition in 2005. There is concern about increasing rates of soil erosion due to ever larger square hectares worked with mechanized equipment and chemical fertilizer and other inputs. With human consumption of seafood having doubled in the last 30 years, seriously depleting multiple seafood fisheries, and destroying the marine ecosystem. As a result, awareness is prompting steps to be taken to create a more sustainable seafood supply. Growing populations, falling energy sources and food shortages will create a perfect storm by 2030, according to UK Chief Government Scientist John Beddington, who noted that food reserves were at a 50-year low, and the world would require 50% more energy, food, and water by 2030. The situation in the Sahel region south of the Sahara, in terms of ongoing deforestation and soil erosion, is very serious. The world will have to produce 70% more food by 2050 to feed a projected extra 2.3 billion people, and as incomes rise. According to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO. Social scientists have warned of the possibility that global civilization is due for a period of contraction and economic relocalization due to a decline in fossil fuels and resulting crises in transportation and food production. Helga Virich has predicted a restoration of sustainable local economic activities based on hunting and gathering, shifting horticulture, and pastoralism. Urbanization. Growth in population during the period of rapid industrialization and globalization in the 20th century was accompanied by increased urbanization on a global basis. Although many critics blame globalization for a decline of the middle class in industrialized countries, the middle class has been growing rapidly in developing countries. This has led to increasing disparities in wealth between urban and rural areas. As a result, mass movements in the countryside at times have expressed objections to globalizing processes. For example, in 2002, in India, 70% of the population lived in rural areas and depended directly on natural resources for their livelihood. By 2011, the majority of the world's population lived in industrialized urban areas featuring nearby factories and business offices rather than in traditional rural areas where agricultural activities predominate. Certain cities began to emerge as global cities generally considered to be important centers of global economic activities. Megacities, cities having a population in excess of 10 million, grew in number from 3 in 1973 to 24 by 2013, with estimates of up to 27 by 2025. Health. Global health is the health of populations in a global context that transcends the perspectives and concerns of individual nations. Health problems that transcend national borders or have a global political and economic impact are emphasized. It has been defined as the area of study, research, and practice that places a priority on improving health and achieving equity in health for all people worldwide. Thus, global health is about worldwide improvement of health, reduction of disparities, and protection against global threats that disregard national borders. The application of these principles to the domain of mental health is called global mental health. SARS checkpoint at Taiwan Taoyuan International Airports. International arrivals in Terminal 1. The major international agency for health is the World Health Organization, WHO. Other important agencies with impact on global health activities include UNICEF, World Food Programme, WFP, United Nations University International Institute for Global Health, and the World Bank. A major initiative for improving global health is the United Nations Millennium Declaration and the globally endorsed Millennium Development Goals. International travel has helped to spread some of the deadliest infectious diseases. One example of this occurring is AIDS/HIV. Due to immigration, approximately 500,000 people in the United States are believed to be infected with Chagas disease. The rate of tuberculosis, TB, among foreign-born persons in the United States was 9.5 times that of U.S.-born persons in 2006. Starting in Asia, the Black Death killed at least one-third of Europe's population in the 14th century. Even worse devastation was inflicted on the American supercontinent by European arrivals. 90% of the populations of the civilizations of the New World such as the Aztec, Maya, and Inca were killed by smallpox brought by European colonization. Global natural environment. The natural environment encompasses all living and non-living things occurring naturally on Earth, or some region thereof. It is an environment that encompasses the interaction of all living species. The natural environment is contrasted with the built environment, which comprises the areas and components that are strongly influenced by humans. It is difficult to find absolutely natural environments. It is common that the naturalness varies in a continuum from ideally 100% natural in one extreme to 0% natural in the other. More precisely, we can consider the different aspects or components of an environment, and see that their degree of naturalness is not uniform, but, instead, there exists a coupled human environment system. Plot based on the NASA GISS Surface Temperature Analysis, GISTEMP, dataset. Human challenges to the natural environment, such as climate change, cross-boundary water and air pollution, overfishing of the ocean, and the spread of invasive species require at least transnational, and, often, global solutions. Since factories in developing countries increase global output and experience less environmental regulation, globally there have been substantial increases in pollution and its impact on water resources. State of the World 2006 report said, India's and China's high economic growth was not sustainable. The report states, the world's ecological capacity is simply insufficient to satisfy the ambitions of China, India, Japan, Europe, and the United States as well as the aspirations of the rest of the world in a sustainable way. In a 2006 news story, BBC reported, if China and India were to consume as much resources per capita as United States or Japan, in 2030 together they would require a full planet Earth to meet their needs. In the long term these effects can lead to increased conflict over dwindling resources, and in the worst case a Malthusian catastrophe. International foreign investment in developing countries could lead to a race to the bottom as countries lower their environmental and resource protection laws to attract foreign capital. The reverse of this theory is true, however, when developed countries maintain positive environmental practices. imparting them to countries they are investing in, and creating a race to the top phenomenon. Burning forest in Brazil. The removal of forest to make way for cattle ranching was the leading cause of deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon from the mid-1960s. Soybeans have become one of the most important contributors to deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon. The time between distances is shrinking between continents and countries due to globalization, causing developing and developed countries to find new ways to solve problems on a global rather than regional scale. Agencies like the United Nations now must be the global regulators of pollution, whereas before, regional governance was enough. Action has been taken by the United Nations to monitor and reduce atmospheric pollutants through the Kyoto Protocol, the Clean Air Initiative, and studies of air pollution and public policy. Global traffic, production, and consumption are causing increased global levels of air pollutants. The Northern Hemisphere has been the leading producer of carbon monoxide and sulfur oxides. Changes in natural capital are beginning to erode the economic logic of one major aspect of economic globalization, an international division of labor and production based on global supply chains. Planetary boundaries for several key environmental resources have been reached and others are near their limits. Over time, peak oil and climate change may result in peak globalization, measured in terms of decreasing ton-miles of freight transported, particularly across oceans and continents. The economic logic of the comparative advantage of global supply chains could be overcome by both increasing transportation costs and interruptions and delays in the transit of freight. China and India substantially increased their fossil fuel consumption as their economies switched from subsistence farming to industry and urbanization. Chinese oil consumption grew by 8% yearly between 2002 and 2006, doubling from 1996-2006. In 2007, China surpassed the United States as the top emitter of CO2. Only 1% of the country's 560 million city inhabitants, 2007, breathe air deemed safe by the European Union. In effect, this means that developed countries may outsource some of the pollution associated with consumption in countries where pollution-intensive industries have been moved. Societies utilize forest resources in order to reach a sustainable level of economic development. Historically, forests in earlier developing nations experience forest transitions, a period of deforestation and reforestation, as a surrounding society becomes more developed, industrialized, and shift their primary resource extraction to other nations via imports. For nations at the periphery of the globalized system, however, there are no others to shift their extraction onto, and forest degradation continues unabated. Forest transitions can have an effect on the hydrology, climate change, and biodiversity of an area by impacting water quality and the accumulation of greenhouse gases through the regrowth of new forest into second and third growth forests. A major source of deforestation is the logging industry, driven by China and Japan. The global marketing of palm oil has led to such a degree of deforestation in Southeast Asia that many species are critically endangered, especially rhinoceros, tigers, and orangutans. Without more recycling, zinc could be used up by 2037, both indium and hafnium could run out by 2017, and terbium could be gone by 2012. Other peak phenomena, such as peak oil, peak coal, peak gas, peak water, and peak wheat, also affect the availability and sustainability of natural capital. In 2003, 29% of open-sea fisheries were in a state of collapse. The journal Science published a 4-year study in November 2006, which predicted that, at the current rate of consumption, supplies of wild seafood will be totally depleted by 2048. Conversely, globalization created a global market for farm-raised fish and seafood, which, as of 2009, was providing 38% of global output, potentially reducing fishing pressure. The global trade in goods depends upon reliable, inexpensive transportation of freight along complex and long-distance supply chains. Global warming and peak oil undermine globalization by their effects on both transportation costs and the reliable movement of freight. countering the current geographic pattern of comparative advantage, with higher transportation costs, climate change, and peak oil would thus result in peak globalization, after which the volume of exports will decline as measured by ton-miles of freight. Global workforce. The global workforce is the international labor pool of workers, including those employed by multinational companies, and connected through a global system of networking and production, immigrant workers, transient migrant workers, telecommuting workers, and those in export-oriented employment or contingent work, and other precarious employment. As of 2012, the global labor pool consisted of approximately 3 billion workers, with around 200 million unemployed. The global workforce, or international labor, reflects a new international division of labor that has been emerging since the late 1970s, in the wake of other forces of globalization. The global economic factors driving the rise of multinational corporations, namely cross-border movement of goods, services, technology, and capital, are changing ways of thinking about labor and the structure of today's workforce. With roots in the social processes surrounding the shift to standardization and industrialization, post-industrial society in the Western world has been accompanied by industrialization in other parts of the world, particularly in Asia. As industrialization takes hold worldwide and more cultures move away from traditional practices in respect to work and labor, the ways in which employers think about and utilize labor are changing. The global workforce is competitive, and has been described as a war for talent. This competitiveness is due, in part, to communications technologies that assist companies to attain multinational status. Communication technologies also allow companies to find workers without limiting their search locally, a process known as global labor arbitrage. An example of this war for talent is the phenomenon of foreign executives appointed into headquarter positions of local organizations. However, production workers and service workers in advanced economies have been unable to compete directly with much lower-cost workers in developing countries. Low-wage countries gain the low-value-added element of work formerly done in rich countries, while higher-value work remained. For instance, the total number of people employed in manufacturing in the U.S. declined, but value added per worker increased. There are many examples of this movement of labor into developing economies. Two examples can be found in China and South Africa. Chinese success cost jobs in other developing countries as well as in the West. From 2000 to 2007, the U.S. lost a total of 3.2 million manufacturing jobs. As of the 26th of April, 2005, in regional giant South Africa, some 300,000 textile workers have lost their jobs in the past 2 years due to the influx of Chinese goods. Nobel Prize-winning economist Michael Spence writes, "The massive changes in the global economy since World War II have had overwhelmingly positive effects. Hundreds of millions of people in the developing world have escaped poverty, and more will in the future. The global economy will continue to grow, probably at least threefold over the next 30 years. One person's gain is not necessarily another's loss. Global growth is not even close to a zero-sum game. But globalization hurts some subgroups within some countries, including the advanced economies. Not everyone is so sanguine about the continuation of economic growth into the future. In Indonesia, for instance, Agustinus Carlo Lumban Raja, head of the Environment and Policy Initiative Department of Indonesian No Sawit Watch, notes, "The proliferation and intensification of horizontal social conflicts over customary land boundaries testifies to the vulnerability of indigenous Malayan people, whose customary lands are being targeted and developed by the private sector without adequate and fully representative prior consultation with the various clans and tribes who lay claims to these lands." International migration. Many countries have some form of guest worker program with policies similar to those found in the U.S. that permit U.S. employers to sponsor non-U.S. citizens as laborers for approximately 3 years to be deported afterwards if they have not yet obtained a green card. As of 2009, over 1 million guest workers reside in the U.S. The largest program, the H-1B visa, has 650,000 workers. In the U.S., and the second largest, the O1 visa, has 350,000. Many other United States visas exist for guest workers as well, including the H-2 visa, which allows farmers to bring in an unlimited number of agricultural guest workers. The United States ran a Mexican guest worker program in the period 1942-1964, known as the Bracero program. About 85% of Dubai's population consists of migrant workers, a majority of whom are from India. An article in the New Republic criticized such guest worker programs by equating the visiting workers to second-class citizens, who would never be able to gain citizenship and would have less residential rights than Americans. Migration of educated and skilled workers is called brain drain. For example, the U.S. welcomes many nurses to come work in the country. The brain drain from Europe to the United States means that some 400,000 European science and technology graduates now live in the U.S., and most have no intention to return to Europe. Nearly 14 million immigrants came to the United States from 2000 to 2010. Immigrants to the United States and their children founded more than 40% of the 2010 Fortune 500 companies. They founded 7 of the 10 most valuable brands in the world. Reverse brain drain is the movement of human capital from a more developed country to a less developed country. It is considered a logical outcome of a calculated strategy, where migrants accumulate savings and develop skills overseas that can be used in their home country. Reverse brain drain can occur when scientists, engineers, or other intellectual elites migrate to a less developed country to learn in its universities, perform research, or gain working experience in areas where education and employment opportunities are limited in their home country. These professionals then return to their home country after several years of experience to start a related business, teach in a university, or work for a multinational in their home country. Remittances. A remittance is a transfer of money by a foreign worker to his or her home country. Remittances are playing an increasingly large role in the economies of many countries, contributing to economic growth and to the livelihoods of less prosperous people, though generally not the poorest of the poor. According to World Bank estimates, remittances totaled US $414 billion in 2009, of which US $16 billion went to developing countries that involved 192 million migrant workers. For some individual recipient countries, remittances can be as high as a third of their GDP. For example, in 2009, Tajikistan's remittance intake, in terms of the percentage of its GDP, was ranked the highest globally at 35%, while in Lebanon, the largest remittance-receiving Arab country, remittances made up around 22% of the GDP. In 2010, India received the largest share of remittances for the year at $55 billion, with China following at a close second with $51 billion. At $334 billion to developing countries for that year, China and India's remittances together nearly made a third of it all. However, India and China's remittance intake, though very high, does not coincide with the statistics of countries receiving remittances as percentage of GDP. This is mostly because remittances have greater effects on small developing countries with smaller economies, and thus GDPs, such as Lebanon and Tajikistan, rather than large ones, such as India and China. Remittance inflows have risen substantially since 2009. By 2013, global remittances had increased to $542 billion, $404 billion of which were sent solely to developing countries. Furthermore, the World Bank's Migration and Development Brief is estimating that by 2016, remittances to developing countries alone will be over $516 billion. A transnational marriage is a marriage between two people from different countries. A variety of special issues arise in marriages between people from different countries, including those related to citizenship and culture, which add complexity and challenges to these kinds of relationships. In an age of increasing globalization, where a growing number of people have ties to networks of people and places across the globe, rather than to a current geographic location, people are increasingly marrying across national boundaries. Transnational marriage is a byproduct of the movement and migration of people. Support and criticism. Reactions to processes contributing to globalization have varied widely with a history as long as extraterritorial contact and trade. Philosophical differences regarding the costs and benefits of such processes give rise to a broad range of ideologies and social movements. Proponents of economic growth, expansion, and development, in general, view globalizing processes as desirable or necessary to the well-being of human society. Antagonists view one or more globalizing processes as detrimental to social well-being on a global or local scale. This includes those who question either the social or natural sustainability of long-term and continuous economic expansion, the social structural inequality caused by these processes, and the colonial, imperialistic, or hegemonic ethnocentrism, cultural assimilation, and cultural appropriation that underlie such processes. Critiques of globalization generally stem from discussion surrounding the impact of such processes on the planet as well as the human costs. They challenge directly traditional metrics, such as GDP, and look to other measures, such as the Gini coefficient or the Happy Planet Index, and point to a multitude of interconnected fatal consequences: social disintegration, a breakdown of democracy, more rapid and extensive deterioration of the environment, the spread of new diseases, increasing poverty and alienation, which they claim are the unintended consequences of globalization. Others point out that, while the forces of globalization have led to the spread of Western-style democracy, this has been accompanied by an increase in interethnic tension and violence as free market economic policies combine with democratic processes of universal suffrage, as well as an escalation in militarization to impose democratic principles and as a means to conflict resolution. Economic liberalism and free trade. George W. Bush and Hu Jintao of China meet while attending an APEC summit in Santiago de Chile, 2004. Economic liberals and neoliberals generally argue that higher degrees of political and economic freedom, in the form of free trade, in the developed world are ends in themselves, producing higher levels of overall material wealth. Globalization is seen as the beneficial spread of liberty and capitalism. Jagdish Bhagwati, a former advisor to the UN on globalization, holds that, although there are obvious problems with overly rapid development, globalization is a very positive force that lifts countries out of poverty by causing a virtuous economic cycle associated with faster economic growth. Economist Paul Krugman is another staunch supporter of globalization and free trade, with the record of disagreeing with many critics of globalization. He argues that many of them lack a basic understanding of comparative advantage and its importance in today's world. The flow of migrants to advanced economic countries has been claimed to provide a means through which global wages converge. An IMF study noted a potential for skills to be transferred back to developing countries as wages in those countries rise. Lastly, the dissemination of knowledge has been an integral aspect of globalization. Technological innovations, or technological transfer, is conjectured to benefit most the developing and least developing countries, LDCs, as for example in the adoption of mobile phones. There has been a rapid economic growth in Asia, after embracing market orientation-based economic policies that encourage private property rights, free enterprise, and competition. In particular, in East Asian developing countries, GDP per head rose at 5.9% a year from 1975 to 2001, according to 2003 Human Development Report of UNDP. Like this, the British economic journalist Martin Wolf says that incomes of poor developing countries, with more than half the world's population, grew substantially faster than those of the world's richest countries, that remained relatively stable in its growth, leading to reduced international inequality and the incidence of poverty. Certain demographic changes in the developing world, after active economic liberalization and international integration, resulted in rising general welfare and, hence, reduced inequality. According to Wolf, in the developing world, As a whole, life expectancy rose by 4 months each year after 1970, and infant mortality rate declined from 107 per thousand in 1970 to 58 in 2000 due to improvements in standards of living and health conditions. Also, adult literacy in developing countries rose from 53% in 1970 to 74% in 1998, and much lower literacy rate among the young guarantees that rates will continue to fall as time passes. Furthermore, the reduction in fertility rate in the developing world as a whole from 4.1 births per woman in 1980 to 2.8 in 2000 indicates improved education level of women on fertility and control of fewer children with more parental attention and investment. Consequently, more prosperous and educated parents with fewer children have chosen to withdraw their children from the labor force to give them opportunities to be educated at school, improving the issue of child labor. Thus, despite seemingly unequal distribution of income within these developing countries, their economic growth and development have brought about improved standards of living and welfare for the population as a whole. Of the factors influencing the duration of economic growth in both developed and developing countries, income equality has a more beneficial impact than trade openness, sound political institutions, and foreign investment. In general, corporate businesses, particularly in the area of finance, see globalization as a positive force in the world. Many economists cite statistics that seem to support such positive impact. For example, per capita gross domestic product, GDP, growth among post-1980 globalizing countries accelerated from 1.4% a year in the 1960s and 2.9% a year in the 1970s to 3.5% in the 1980s and 5.0% in the 1990s. This acceleration in growth seems even more remarkable given that the rich countries saw steady declines in growth from a high of 4.7% in the 1960s to 2.2% in the 1990s. Also, the non-globalizing developing countries seem to fare worse than the globalizers, with the former's annual growth rates falling from highs of 3.3% during the 1970s to only 1.4% during the 1990s. This rapid growth among the globalizers is not simply due to the strong performances of China and India in the 1980s and 1990s. 18 out of the 24 globalizers experienced increases in growth, many of them quite substantial. The globalization of the late 20th and early 21st centuries has led to the resurfacing of the idea that the growth of economic interdependence promotes peace. This idea had been very powerful during the globalization of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and was a central doctrine of classical liberals of that era, such as the young John Maynard Keynes, 1883 to 1946. Some opponents of globalization see the phenomenon as a promotion of corporatist interests. They also claim that the increasing autonomy and strength of corporate entities shapes the political policy of countries. They advocate global institutions and policies that they believe better address the moral claims of poor and working classes as well as environmental concerns. Economic arguments by fair trade theorists claim that unrestricted free trade benefits those with more financial leverage, i.e. the rich, at the expense of the poor. Globalization allows corporations to outsource manufacturing and service jobs from high-cost locations, creating economic opportunities with the most competitive wages and worker benefits. Critics of globalization say that it disadvantages poorer countries. While it is true that free trade encourages globalization among countries, some countries try to protect their domestic suppliers. The main export of poorer countries is usually agricultural productions. Larger countries often subsidize their farmers, e.g., we use common agricultural policy, which lowers the market price for foreign crops. Global democracy. Democratic globalization is a movement towards an institutional system of global democracy that would give world citizens a say in political organizations. This would, in their view, bypass nation-states, corporate oligopolies, ideological non-governmental organizations, political cults, and mafias. One of its most prolific proponents is the British political thinker David Held. Advocates of democratic globalization argue that economic expansion and development should be the first phase of democratic globalization, which is to be followed by a phase of building global political institutions. Dr. Francesco Stipo, director of the United States Association of the Club of Rome, advocates unifying nations under a world government, suggesting that it should reflect the political and economic balances of world nations. The World Confederation would not supersede the authority of the state governments, but rather complement it, as both the states and the World Authority would have power within their sphere of competence. Former Canadian Senator Douglas Roche, OC, viewed globalization as inevitable and advocated creating institutions such as a directly elected United Nations Parliamentary Assembly to exercise oversight over unelected international bodies. Global Civics. Monument to Multiculturalism by Francesco Borelli in Toronto, Canada. 4 identical sculptures are located in Buffalo City, South Africa, Chongqing, China, Sarajevo, Bosnia, and Sydney, Australia. Global civics suggests that civics can be understood, in a global sense, as a social contract between global citizens, in the age of interdependence and interaction. The disseminators of the concept define it as the notion that we have certain rights and responsibilities towards each other by the mere fact of being human on Earth. World citizen has a variety of similar meanings, often referring to a person who disapproves of traditional geopolitical divisions derived from national citizenship. An early incarnation of this sentiment can be found in Socrates, who Plutarch quoted as saying, "I am not an Athenian or a Greek, but a citizen of the world." In an increasingly interdependent world, world citizens need a compass to frame their mindsets and create a shared consciousness and sense of global responsibility in world issues such as environmental problems and nuclear proliferation. Cosmopolitanism is the proposal that all human ethnic groups belong to a single community based on a shared morality. A person who adheres to the idea of cosmopolitanism, in any of its forms, is called a cosmopolitan or cosmopolite. A cosmopolitan community might be based on an inclusive morality, a shared economic relationship, or a political structure that encompasses different nations. The cosmopolitan community is one in which individuals from different places, e.g. nation-states, form relationships based on mutual respect. For instance, Kwame Anthony Appiah suggests the possibility of a cosmopolitan community in which individuals from varying locations, physical, economic, etc., enter relationships of mutual respect despite their differing beliefs, religious, political, etc. Canadian philosopher Marshall McLuhan popularized the term global village beginning in 1962. His view suggested that globalization would lead to a world where people from all countries will become more integrated and aware of common interests and shared humanity. International cooperation. Military cooperation. Past examples of international cooperation exist. One example is the security cooperation between the United States and the former Soviet Union after the end of the Cold War, which astonished international society. Arms control and disarmament agreements, including the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, see START I, START II, START III, and New START, and the establishment of NATO's Partnership for Peace, the Russia-NATO Council, and the G8 Global Partnership against the spread of weapons and materials of mass destruction, constitute concrete initiatives of arms control and denuclearization. The U.S.-Russian cooperation was further strengthened by anti-terrorism agreements enacted in the wake of 9/11. Environmental cooperation. One of the biggest successes of environmental cooperation has been the agreement to reduce chlorofluorocarbon (CFC) emissions, as specified in the Montreal Protocol, in order to stop ozone depletion. The most recent debate around nuclear energy and the non-alternative coal-burning power plants constitutes one more consensus on what not to do. Thirdly, significant achievements in IC can be observed through development studies. Anti-globalization movement. Anti-globalization, or counter-globalization, consists of a number of criticisms of globalization, but, in general, is critical of the globalization of corporate capitalism. The movement is also commonly referred to as the alter-globalization movement, anti-globalist movement, anti-corporate globalization movement, or movement against neoliberal globalization. It can be explained as encompassing the ideologies present in the following other movements which will be discussed below: opposition to capital market integration, social justice and inequality, anti-consumerism, anti-global governance, and environmentalist opposition. Each of these ideologies can be framed around a specific strand of the anti-globalization movement, but in general the movement gears their efforts towards all of these primary principles. It is considered a rather new and modern-day social movement, as the issues it is fighting against are relevant in today's time. However, the events that occurred which fuels the movement can be traced back through the lineage of the movement of a 500-year-old history of resistance against European colonialism and U.S. imperialism. This refers to the continent of Africa being colonized and stripped of their resources by the Europeans in the 19th century. It is also related closely with the anti-Vietnam War mobilizations between 1960 and 1970, with worldwide protests against the adjustment of structure in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. In general, opponents of globalization in developed countries are disproportionately middle class and college educated. This contrasts sharply with the situation in developing countries, where the anti-globalization movement has been more successful in enlisting a broader group, including millions of workers and farmers. These supporters of the movement are aware of the unequal power and respect in terms of international trade between the developed and underdeveloped countries of the world. The activists that support the AGM, as mentioned previously before, can range in terms of the specific issue that they oppose. Again, there are a few different dimensions of globalization: economic, political, cultural, ecological, and ideological. The diverse subgroups that make up this movement include some of the following: trade unionists, environmentalists, anarchists, land rights and indigenous rights activists, organizations promoting human rights and sustainable development, opponents of privatization, and anti-sweatshop campaigners, as summarized by Noam Chomsky. The dominant propaganda systems have appropriated the term globalization to refer to the specific version of international economic integration that they favor, which privileges the rights of investors and lenders, those of people being incidental. In accord with this usage, those who favor a different form of international integration, which privileges the rights of human beings, become anti-globalist. This is simply vulgar propaganda, like the term anti-Soviet used by the most disgusting commissars to refer to dissidents. It is not only vulgar, but idiotic. Take the World Social Forum, WSF, called anti-globalization in the propaganda system, which happens to include the media, the educated classes, etc., with rare exceptions. The WSF is a paradigm example of globalization. It is a gathering of huge numbers of people from all over the world, from just about every corner of life one can think of, apart from the extremely narrow, highly privileged elites, who meet at the competing World Economic Forum, and are called pro-globalization by the propaganda system. Movement tactics. Snow et al. Contend that the anti-globalization movement is an example of a new social movement, which uses tactics that are unique and use different resources than previously used before in other social movements. 301 actors of the movement participate in things such as disruptive tactics. These include flash mobs, for example, which work extremely well in catching the attention of others and spreading awareness about the issue of globalization. There is also the spreading of information about the social movement through social media and word of mouth about NGOs, organizations, and movement groups working to help alleviate the effects of globalization. Websites such as Twitter and Facebook have become a useful outlet for people to become aware of what is going on around the globe, any protests or tactics taking place, and the progress of non-governmental organizations aiding in these impoverished countries. One of the most infamous tactics of the movement is the Battle of Seattle in 1999, where there were protests against the World Trade Organization's third ministerial meeting. It can be described as being a massive group of passionate, grassroots people within the anti-globalization movement protesting against the WTO's corporate rule. All over the world, the movement has held protests outside meetings of institutions such as the WTO, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, and the Group of Eight, G8. Within the Seattle demonstrations, the protesters that participated used both creative and violent tactics to gain the attention towards the issue of globalization. It is still one of the most significant and memorable social movement protests in the past 20 years. Opposition to capital market integration. World Bank protester, Jakarta, Indonesia. Capital markets have to do with raising and investing monies in various human enterprises. Increasing integration of these financial markets between countries leads to the emergence of a global capital marketplace, or a single world market. In the long run, increased movement of capital between countries tends to favor owners of capital more than any other group. In the short run, owners and workers in specific sectors in capital exporting countries bear much of the burden of adjusting to increased movement of capital. 302 It is not surprising that these conditions lead to political divisions about whether or not to encourage or increase international capital market integration. Those opposed to capital market integration on the basis of human rights issues are especially disturbed by the various abuses which they think are perpetuated by global and international institutions that, they say, promote neoliberalism without regard to ethical standards. This can also be referred to as corporate capitalism, as previous mentioned, which are money-driven organizations such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, along with many of the popular and competitive multinational corporations like Nike and other institutions. Common targets include the World Bank, WB, International Monetary Fund, IMF, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, and the World Trade Organization, WTO, and free trade treaties, like the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, Free Trade Area of the Americas, FTAA, the Multilateral Agreement on Investment, MI, and the General Agreement on Trade and Services, GATS. In light of the economic gap between rich and poor countries, movement adherents claim free trade without measures in place to protect the undercapitalized will contribute only to the strengthening the power of industrialized nations, often termed the North in opposition to the developing world South. Some of the powerful northern corporations have implemented policies like privatizing public industry and reducing tariffs. By doing this, it has created a growth in sweatshops in the developing world, where wages are minimal and unfair, and conditions are unsafe to the workers' health and psychological state. The global north can benefit from this by getting goods for a cheaper monetary amount. However, this is at the expense of these impoverished people and the community or country as a whole. Now, fair trade has been introduced in order to attempt to rebuild the economies of third world countries by paying employees who work to produce goods to be exported a fair price for their efforts. 303. Anti-corporatism and anti-consumerism. Corporatist ideology, which privileges the rights of corporations, artificial or juridical persons, over those of natural persons, is an underlying factor in the recent rapid expansion of global commerce. 304 In recent years, there have been an increasing number of books, Naomi Klein's 2000 No Logo, for example, and films, e.g. The Corporation and Surplus, popularizing an anti-corporate ideology to the public. A related contemporary ideology, consumerism, which encourages the personal acquisition of goods and services, also drives globalization. 305 Anti-consumerism is a social movement against equating personal happiness with consumption and the purchase of material possessions. Concern over the treatment of consumers by large corporations has spawned substantial activism and the incorporation of consumer education into school curricula. Social activists hold materialism is connected to global retail merchandising and supplier convergence, or greed, enemy, crime, environmental degradation, and general social malaise and discontent. One variation on this topic is activism by post-consumers, with a strategic emphasis on moving beyond addictive consumerism. 306. Global justice and inequality. Global justice. Differences in national income equality around the world as measured by the National Gini Coefficient, 2009. The global justice movement is the loose collection of individuals and groups often referred to as a movement of movements who advocate fair trade rules and perceive current institutions of global economic integration as problems. 307. The movement is often labeled an anti-globalization movement by the mainstream media. Those involved, however, frequently deny that they are anti-globalization, insisting that they support the globalization of communication and people, and oppose only the global expansion of corporate power. 308. The movement is based in the idea of social justice, desiring the creation of a society or institution based on the principles of equality and solidarity, the values of human rights, and the dignity of every human being. 309, 310, 311. Social inequality, with an end between nations, including a growing global digital divide, is a focal point of the movement. Many non-governmental organizations have now arisen to fight these inequalities that many in Latin America, Africa, and Asia face. A few very popular and well-known non-governmental organizations include War Child, Red Cross, Free the Children, and Care International. They often create partnerships where they work towards improving the lives of those who live in third world countries by building schools, fixing infrastructure, cleaning water supplies, purchasing equipment and supplies for hospitals, and other aid efforts. Social inequality. The economies of the world have developed unevenly, historically, such that entire geographical regions were left mired in poverty and disease, while others began to reduce poverty and disease on a wholesale basis. From around 1980 through at least 2011, the GDP gap, while still wide, appeared to be closing. And, in some more rapidly developing countries, life expectancies began to rise. 312. If we look at the Gini coefficient for world income, since the late 1980s, the gap between some regions has markedly narrowed between Asia and the advanced economies of the West, for example, but huge gaps remain globally. Overall equality across humanity, considered as individuals, has improved very little. Within the decade between 2003 and 2013, income inequality grew even in traditionally egalitarian countries like Germany, Sweden, and Denmark. With a few exceptions, France, Japan, Spain, the top 10% of earners in most advanced economies raced ahead, while the bottom 10% fell further behind. 313. By 2013, a tiny elite of multi-billionaires, 85 to be exact, has amassed wealth equivalent to all the wealth owned by the poorest half, 3.5 billion, of the world's total population of 7,314. Critics of globalization argue that globalization results in weak labor unions, the surplus and cheap labor coupled with an ever-growing number of companies in transition weakened labor unions in high-cost areas. Unions lose their effectiveness and workers their enthusiasm for unions when membership begins to decline. They also cite an increase in the exploitation of child labor. Countries with weak protections for children are vulnerable to infestation by rogue companies and criminal gangs who exploit them. Examples include quarrying, salvage, and farm work, as well as trafficking, bondage, forced labor, prostitution, and pornography. 315. Immigrant Rights March for Amnesty, Los Angeles, on May Day, 2006. Women often participate in the workforce in precarious work, including export-oriented employment. Evidence suggests that while globalization has expanded women's access to employment, the long-term goal of transforming gender inequalities remains unmet and appears unattainable without regulation of capital and a reorientation and expansion of the state's role in funding public goods and providing a social safety net. 316. Anti-global governance. Beginning in the 1930s, Opposition arose to the idea of a world government, as advocated by organizations such as the World Federalist Movement, WFM. 317. Those who oppose global governance typically do so on objections that the idea is infeasible, inevitably oppressive, or simply unnecessary. 318. In general, these opponents are wary of the concentration of power or wealth that such governance might represent. Such reasoning dates back to the founding of the League of Nations, and, later, the United Nations. Environmentalist opposition. Deforestation of the Madagascar Highland Plateau has led to extensive siltation and unstable flows of western rivers. Environmentalism is a broad philosophy, ideology. 319, 320, 321 and social movement regarding concerns for environmental conservation and improvement of the health of the environment. Environmentalist concerns with globalization include issues such as global warming, climate change, global water supply and water crises, inequity in energy consumption and energy conservation, transnational air pollution and pollution of the world ocean, overpopulation, world habitat sustainability, deforestation, biodiversity, and species extinction. Another concern is labeled environmental apartheid. 322, which claims that the resources and wealth of society are typically appropriated by a small minority group of a privileged race or class, under much protection. Thus, the excluded majority never gets a chance to access to resources necessary for well-being and survival. In the pre-Rio period, it was the North that contributed most to the destruction of the environment. Globalization is restructuring control over resources in such a way that the natural resources of the poor are systematically taken over by the rich and the pollution promulgated by the rich is systematically dumped on the poor. 323. For example, 90% of historic carbon dioxide emissions have been by the industrialized countries. The developed countries produce 90% of the hazardous wastes produced around the world every year. Global free trade has globalized this environmental destruction in an asymmetric pattern. Some argue the economy is controlled by northern corporations, and they are increasingly exploiting resources of less wealthy countries for their global activities, while it is the South that is disproportionately bearing the environmental burden of the globalized economy. Globalization is thus leading to a type of environmental apartheid. 324. Helena Norberg, the director and founder of the International Society for Ecology and Culture, ISEC, criticizes globalization in many ways. In her book Ancient Futures, Norberg claims that centuries of ecological balance and social harmony are under threat from the pressures of development and globalization. She also criticizes the standardization and rationalization of globalization, as it does not always yield the expected growth outcomes. Although globalization takes similar steps in most countries, scholars such as Hodge claim that it might not be effective to certain countries, for globalization has actually moved some countries backward instead of developing them. 325. A related area of concern is the pollution haven hypothesis, which posits that, when large industrialized nations seek to set up factories or offices abroad, they will often look for the cheapest option in terms of resources and labor that offers the land and material access they require. See Race to the Bottom. 326. This often comes at the cost of environmentally sound practices. Developing countries with cheap resources and labor tend to have less stringent environmental regulations, and conversely, nations with stricter environmental regulations become more expensive for companies, as a result of the costs associated with meeting these standards. Thus, companies that choose to physically invest in foreign countries tend to relocate to the countries with the lowest environmental standards or weakest enforcement.